This is the Prophecy Project. Understanding the times, the nations in military conflicts, with Bible teacher and author Alan Bonk.
Welcome to session number 21 of the Prophecy Project. Last session, I went through Daniel chapter 2, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The king asked all of his pagan wise men to tell him the dream and also the interpretation. The Chaldeans got the king angry, and he passed a sentence of death upon all the wise men of Babylon. Unfortunately, Daniel and his brethren were included with the wise men. Daniel sought and received from the God of heaven, the God of his fathers, the dream and interpretation. The king had dreamed of a great image, an image of a man with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a belly of brass and legs of iron, and 2 feet and 10 toes of iron and clay. We covered the meaning and the empires by name from the head to the ankles last week. They are Babylon, the head of gold, Medes and the Persians, the chest and arms of silver, the Greeks, the belly of brass, and the Romans, the 2 legs of iron, the East and the West Roman Empire. I did not have time to cover the 2 feet and the 10 toes, but now I want to look in and to explore those 2 feet. We read in Daniel chapter 2, 33 and 34, that the 2 feet which proceed from the 2 legs was smote with a stone cut out without hands, whose origins are not from man or from earth. And the feet of clay and iron were broken, and the whole image came crashing down at that time. Now, let's look at verse 41. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, and the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of iron, forasmuch as thou sawest iron mixed with clay. Verse 42. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. In the description of the dream itself, the toes are not mentioned specifically, only as the feet. But in the interpretation, the toes are acknowledged and shown to be also part of iron and clay, and that the strong part of them, the toes, is the iron, and that iron has been shown, of course, to be military might. We saw that in the legs. And we know that the military might is also an extension of economic strength. The term broken used here means coming apart. It's used to describe the least part of the elements of the toes, and that is the clay. Verse 43. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. This verse adds a dimension to the description that at least part of the weakness is the different peoples or families, the seed of men. These differing peoples or cultures are united at some level, perhaps in purpose, but they don't trust or like each other. They're not cleaving one to another. This is seen to be a weakness or a brokenness within the kingdom. They also are attached to 2 different feet and the 2 different legs. Thus, there's an eastern side and a western, each coming out of the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire. The people of the Roman Empire were not all Roman anyway, but rather many different peoples ruled or controlled by the Romans, with many different nations and geographical areas represented. Verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and that kingdom shall not be left to another people, But it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. These 10 toes and the fractured alliance are the last best attempt of the world's kingdoms to defeat God. At the end of the age, it'll be over. Daniel told the king that the dream applied to the last days, so we know what we're talking about here. The sequence of empires represents the cosmos, or the world system, founded in Babel so long ago. This is another account of the battle, also of Revelation 19, when God returns from heaven and sets up a kingdom. These 2 feet and 10 toes are also another representation of the beast kingdom, as seen in Revelation 17. The 10 horns, the lion, the bear, and the leopard. All are the same thing. Now, verse 45. Forasmuch as thou sawest the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, and it brake in pieces the iron and the brass and the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and that the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is sure. The stone cut out without hands means that this is God's doing. This is something that God is going to do. And man has no place or no part in the glory. And the system of the empires of man, are gone, never to rise. Revelation 11:15 speaks of this exact event in time. The kingdoms of this world, the cosmos, are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Verse 46. Then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, fell on his face and worshipped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. And the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing that thou couldest reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel a great man, gave him many gifts, made him a ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel requested of the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the kings. Now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the 3 fellows. This is their Hebrew name rather than their Babylonian name. Daniel did not want the authority of ruling over the wise men or the province of Babylon, but handed it off to his fellows and took up a position of counselor to the king. That's what it means to sit in the gate. Now, let's turn back to Revelation chapter 17. We've covered the woman, Mega Babylon, the daughter of Babylon, and we know it to be America. We've also covered the beast as a man and found him to be the Assyrian, as revealed in his apostasy. In other words, late in life, he's the beast. But now I want to identify the 10 horns, the lion, the bear, and the leopard. They are shown to be a composite empire. In Revelation chapter 13, starting in verse 1, we'll see this. Verse 1, and I, John, stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw the beast, one beast, rise up out of the sea, having 10 heads, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Upon his horns, 10 crowns, and upon his heads, the name of blasphemy. Verse 2, and the beast was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. Daniel had showed us the same beast in Daniel chapter 7, and we've looked at it before, but with some interesting twists. Daniel sees that beast rise out of the sea, just like John, except there are initially 4 beasts rising in a sequence, and it starts with the lion, then the bear, and then the leopard. And they lost their dominance to the final beast, which was the beast with the 10 horns. The final 3 don't die, but they end up having to submit or lose their dominance to the beast of the 10 horns at the end, whose leader is the little horn, the Assyrian, which we've studied. When the 10 horns are dominant over the 3 beasts, we then have the beast, as we see in Revelation 13, a single beast with 10 horns, and the 10 horns coming up last in time. This will relate to the feet and the 10 toes of Daniel's chapter 2. Now, let's study that beast as seen in Revelation chapter 17. Verse 8, the beast that thou sawest was not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. When they behold the beast that was, existed, was not, doesn't exist now, and at the time of the writing of this prophecy, 90 A.D., the time of the vision, and yet will exist again, and it is yet to come. Verse 9, and here's the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains, and I call them foundations, on which the woman sitteth, or is built. And there are 7 kings, or empires. 5 are fallen, they're gone. 1 is, which is existed now at the time of the vision, around 90 A.D., and the other is yet to come. It does not exist until the end times. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. It won't last long. It's going to come up and be defeated. This is a sequence of historic empires, counting backwards from the 10 kings, for a total of 7 empires. Now, we have no problem knowing which empires God sees as important in this sequence. They would be the same empires as indicated in Daniel chapter 2 as the great image, and we walked through the image. However, there is one caveat, that being, when you count backwards from the Roman Empire to come to Babylon, it is the 4th empire behind Rome, not the 5th. Greeks, Persians, Medes, and then Babylon, 4. But since we are told that 5 are fallen, we must step back one more kingdom. That kingdom is Assyria, which ruled until around 612 BC. This makes perfect sense, knowing that the little horn is an Assyrian and comes from or is of one of the 7 heads. Verse 11, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. The man that manifests out of the sequence of the 7 historic empires is considered to be the 8th. Why are we told this? We could just know his origins without him being called the 8th one. There are times when the beast in Revelation is everything, including the 7 historic empires, the 10 kings of the end times, and the 4 animal empires which we see manifest. At times, the beast is only the 7, and other times, the 10. Often, it's hard to identify who is being spoken of. I believe that by calling the man beast, or Asher, the 8th, he is separating him from the 7. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, we are told that the beast with the 7 heads has one of those heads, one of the 7, wounded to death, and the deadly wound is healed. The Assyrian, or the man beast, is not one of the 7. He, the man, is called the 8th. It's very possible that the head that is wounded is not the man or a man at all, but rather one of the 7 empires which existed that was gone, then returns in the end times to fulfill the major part or a major part in the events of the world at the end. That nation would be Assyria, which does not exist now in the 20th century and appears to be a dead nation. The British cut it up into pieces and could never be reestablished in the Middle East again based on Islam and modern Muslim dominance of the Middle East. But what a miracle it would be if the Assyrian people were to get their land back. And then out of Assyria comes the 8th, which is Asher. We were told in Isaiah 23:13 that the Assyrian will found the nation for them in the end. For those Assyrians who are in diaspora all out through the wilderness, God was able to reestablish Israel in the Middle East, despite the Muslim world and their opposition. He did this in 1948. Why not Assyria? Now, we had, last week, followed the empires from Babylon all the way through the Romans, and we went to the ankles of the great image. But what about the feet? History tells us that the next major empire to control the Middle East is the Ottoman Empire. This took place. The Ottomans came up. They created a caliphate, which ruled from AD 1458 all the way through 1919, nearly 500 years. The Ottomans actually defeated the Roman Empire in Constantinople in 1458. That's the date I'm using, ending the old Roman Empire. But despite their best efforts and their best attempts, the Ottomans were never able to rule or control Europe. They only controlled the Eastern Roman Empire. They did not fulfill the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. The 2 feet and the 10 toes coming up out of both legs, both branches. As it turns out, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and other kings of Europe turned the Muslims back and stopped Islam from changing times. Islam, I believe, was meant to be an event of the Herod syndrome, which we had covered in earlier sessions. And we covered them earlier so that we could understand right now what's going on with Islam. But the Ottoman Empire was defeated in 1919 at the end of World War I and effectively dismantled. One of the first effects of this dismantling was that the lion of the British Empire took control of much of the Middle East, especially Israel. The British Empire was not going to last long after this time. Though the British have never been destroyed, they have had to back off. Militarily, they were not destroyed, but they lost their empire just the same, one nation at a time. Their strength and influence in the Middle East began to just wane. Their last military action there was a joint operation with France in the 1950s against Egypt, which ended in a debacle. Since that time, England has lost her feathers. They have been plucked one by one, and by and large, England has been given a man's heart, and the lion heart of Britain has been taken away. The British were strongly opposed to the reestablishment of Israel, even outlawing immigration of Jews to Palestine and fighting it. And their support of Arab opposition to the Jews, they did that at nearly every turn. But with British influence gone from the Middle East, it was the Russians who stepped in as the next great power to wield military might and influence in the area and oppose the Jewish state at every turn. But the Russian bear has stepped back. When the Soviet Union basically went bankrupt and lost most of the nations it controlled, It has in recent days attempted to reestablish some level of influence into Syria, but it is really just taking sides on some issues. The real power to rise in the Middle East when the Russians stepped back was militant Islam. While not a nation or an empire in the Western sense of the word, it is a nation, and with the desires to establish or reestablish a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate in the Middle East, and even beyond into the world. The common goals of Islam is not disputed amongst Muslims. They know this. But rather, there is infighting to see who is going to be in charge of the new caliphate and who will get the honor of destroying Israel and the West. I believe the Islamic militant movement is the leopard that has its heads facing in every direction and its wings to fly around the world and to force on the world Sharia law. Wherever it goes, it does this. It isn't well organized to the outside world. To us, it looks totally discombobulated, but it is, at the spiritual level, well organized. The next major player on a world scene will be the 10 horns or toes. They will arise out of the East and the West Roman Empire. It will take dominion from the Muslims in the Middle East. That's what it's supposed to do. Now, I'm going to stop here. I need to close this session at this point, but in the next session, I want to cover these 10 toes, which are the final 10 kings, or commanders, I believe, of the final kingdom. And I want to cover it well, and I want to cover it in detail. Thank you.
This was only one session of many. Be sure to continue watching the Prophecy Project series. If you would like to read more information on this subject, you can find Alan's books on Amazon.com.